Hello everyone. The purpose of this video is to abstractly and deeply explore the relationship between self-interest and morality. It's for those of you who really want to dive deep into this issue. So some philosophers like Ayn Rand believe that morality is all about self-interest. She believes the right act is the one that is in your rational long-term self-interest. And this idea that the right act is the one that is in your self-interest is called ethical egoism. Now, there are other philosophers and thinkers in history that have also argued something similar, that morality is ultimately about self-interest somehow. So we have Thomas Hobbes, we have Thrasymachus and Glaucon in Plato's Republic. And there are many more philosophers, thinkers, economists. And you or your neighbor may just get fed up with so-called altruistic morality and say it's all about self-interest somehow, some way. So let's begin by clarifying the nature of ethical egoism, the idea that it's all about self-interest, in 4 points. So first, notice ethical egoists do not believe you should do whatever you want. If you want to eat potato chips and drink vodka all day, the ethical egoist will tell you that doing so is not in your long-term self-interest, and so you shouldn't do it. So an ethical egoist can live a disciplined life in which she sacrifices her current desires for the well-being of her future self. That is, she sacrifices to achieve her rational, objective self-interest. Okay, the second point is that when I teach this, many students initially think that ethical egoists must be really awful people, always seeking their self-interest. It must be easy to identify these ethical egoists. So they believe ethical egoists must be killing, stealing, cheating all the time, since the egoism encourages self-interest. But this does not follow. Intelligent ethical egoists say that they refrain from these so-called immoral acts because they are not in their long-term self-interest. It's not in their self-interest to end up in prison, alienated by other people, or pursued by your conscience or the Furies. So egoists, ethical egoists, will often help others, give to charities, donate blood, because they believe it's ultimately in their self-interest to do so. So in short, the second point is that it can be difficult to identify the egoist based on behavior alone, since they often act just like the non-egoist. So the third point I want to make to steelman this ethical egoism is that most egoists believe the world would be a better place if everyone used reason to understand human nature and follow their rational self-interests. So for example, let's say that Bob creates a new type of convenience store to earn money. The consequence of his self-interested action is that you benefit since you now have a local store. It's a win-win situation. And so the idea is that the world is better for everyone when we mind our own business while pursuing self-interest. In short, ethical egoists do not believe the world will collapse if everyone rationally pursues their self-interest. On the contrary, they'll think it will be a better world. It's very similar to laissez-faire economics, to videos by people like John Stossel, and so on. In short, many ethical egoists just believe the world would be a better place if everyone rationally pursued their own self-interest. Okay, so the fourth point is it's important to distinguish ethical egoism from psychological egoism. So ethical egoism is a normative theory. It says the morally right action is the one that promotes your long-term rational self-interest. But psychological egoism, by contrast, is a descriptive theory. It claims that every human action is ultimately motivated by self-interest, whether we admit it or not. And you can see my other video on psychological egoism if you're interested in that form of it. Now, what's important here to notice is that you could be an ethical egoist, but not a psychological egoist. So you could believe that it's possible to be altruistic, but as an ethical egoist, you believe that you should act self-interestedly. You should not be altruistic. So again, you could be an ethical egoist, but not a psychological egoist. In short, try not to confuse ethical and psychological egoism. Okay, before we get into the criticisms of ethical egoism, of this idea that morality is all about self-interest, let's look at some reasons why people are drawn to it, some of the strengths of it. The first reason is it's a challenge to self-sacrifice. So many people see so-called common morality as too focused on altruism and self-sacrifice. But ethical egoism offers an alternative. Your life matters, it says, and putting yourself is a virtue, not a vice. And psychology supports this. People who are too agreeable, they often neglect their own needs, and that leads to resentment, which is not good. So ethical egoism reminds us to practice self-compassion and pursue our own goals instead of always living for others. All right. A second reason people are drawn to ethical egoism is because they criticize misguided altruism. So there's an old saying that says, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Ayn Rand argued that altruism and charity can foster dependency rather than growth. And giving people fish instead of teaching them to fish makes them weaker. So ethical egoism encourages self-development instead of unhealthy dependence on altruistic people, for example. Now, other people are drawn to ethical egoism for a third reason, and maybe it's captured pretty well by Nietzsche's critique of morality. So Nietzsche argued that traditional morality often comes from resentment. So the weak condemn the strong and disguise their weakness as kindness. So the kind tiger is the one with no claws. Now, in contrast, ethical egoism rejects this weakness and affirms excellence, self-development, and strength. So it resists moralities that hold people back in the name of sacrifice. And then finally, another reason a lot of people are drawn to ethical egoism and to Ayn Rand is for political or economic reasons. So some defend it for political reasons, arguing that society works best when individuals pursue their own rational self-interest with minimal government interference. It's called laissez-faire. So Ayn Rand defended this view, and libertarians like John Stossel argue that many so-called evil rich become wealthy by creating goods that people want, by growing the pie rather than stealing it. And there's a video on the screen. You can check that out if you want. So in this sense, serving oneself often means serving others. So these are some of the reasons why people are drawn to ethical egoism, to the idea that morality is ultimately about self-interest, or that morality should always be about self-interest. But is that right? Is morality ultimately about self-interest? And should you always try to act in your true self-interest? Let's take a look at some critical questions to evaluate this. So the first criticism is brought up by this question. Are ethical egoists capable of true love in the deeper forms of friendship? And here's the idea. True love involves wanting the good of the other, as other. But ethical egoism says you should only want the good of the other if it benefits you. So you want their good because it's in self-interest, not simply because it's their good. But if true love is wanting what's good because it's their good, then that's beyond the reach of the egoist. Let's see if we can dance around this and make it a little more clear. True love is wanting the good of the other as other, whereas egoistic love wants the other's good because of some benefit to the self. So the criticism is ethical egoism makes one blind to this type of deeper love. Again, the egoist is missing out on the most fulfilling of experiences if there is something more than self in the deepest forms of human love and friendship. If love sometimes involves surrendering the self or self-interest, then the egoist simply cannot experience or find meaning in this love. Now, one thing that's interesting here, we'll look at the response in just a minute, but one thing that's interesting is that mystics in all traditions describe this type of love. But you can also see it in first-time parents who suddenly discover that their children are more important than themselves, or at least just as important. So this type of love, again, is beyond the reach of the egoist because the goal in egoism is to always benefit the self. Consciously, you're thinking of the self, right? And your child is not yourself unless you inflate the meaning of self. So the conclusion is that ethical egoism may be good in a world where people are like individual atoms colliding with each other, but it's blind in a world with true love and true friendship. And that criticism comes from Lawrence Hinman. Again, the criticism implies that the ethical egoist cannot understand the mystics or good parents who know it's good to intrinsically value other people just as they intrinsically value themselves. Now, here's an ethical egoist response. They may counter that true love is impossible, and we just need to understand that all good love is really self-interested, or should be self-interested. So, for example, Ayn Rand argued that romantic love is focused on the self, since no one wants to be loved from moral duty, right? You can understand her point by recognizing that you want your boyfriend or girlfriend to be with you because they want to, not because they must. So in short, the ethical egoist usually responds by arguing all good love is self-interested. But the debate continues. The criticism of ethical egoism stands if there are forms of love and beauty and meaning that require one to temporarily lose the self or transcend it instead of seeking a benefit for the self. Now, in my opinion, this is a strong criticism, and most egoists believe in true love, but they do not understand how it contradicts their belief that true love is based solely on self-interest. So, we'll move to criticism 2 in just a moment, but as a discussion, consider this. In John 3:3, Jesus said, "I tell you the truth, unless you die and are born again, you cannot see the kingdom of God." In Buddhism, there is the idea of no self. In Hinduism, scholars discuss how Atman, the small self, and Brahman, the big self or ultimate reality, are one. So all of these wisdom and religious traditions, or a lot of them at least, describe a love and enlightenment that arises with the loss of self, or separation from the self that you once identified with. A different way of thinking and being, so you're not just thinking of an interest to yourself. So are they describing a meaningful way beyond the reach of the egoist? That's for you to consider and form your own reasoned opinion on. All right, let's move to criticism 2. Now, criticism 2 is just about the meaning of self and self-interest, and it gets really confusing. You've probably thought of this criticism already. First of all, imagine a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. Is it preserving itself? Well, no, it's becoming a butterfly, right? Is it becoming itself? Like in a natural law sense, it's becoming what it's meant to be, a butterfly? Is it losing itself? Or is it like a rope over an abyss where it's constantly becoming and overcoming and there is no self? What exactly do you mean by self-interest? So when you look at textbook arguments on this issue, they'll point out that we really do want to clarify what we mean by self and self-interest when you discuss these topics. And one thing that the textbooks point out here is that self-interest means the motive is about me instead of from me. So, for example, if Bob's only reason for jumping on a grenade is to save 10 children, then his motive is not self-interested because the goal is to save the children. They're good, right? Instead of benefiting himself. The fact that a part of him wants to jump on the grenade does not make his motive selfish or self-interested instead of altruistic. In short, the motive has to be ultimately about you and your self-interest and not just from you to be self-interested. Now, one more example. Let's say somebody who's an atheist sacrifices themselves for their children. You would be greatly inflating the meaning of self-interest if you describe that as a self-interested act because you're killing yourself, right, to save your children. You're seeking your children's good. If you say that that's self-interested, you're inflating the meaning of self to include your children now instead of just you. But that's not self-interested. That's getting closer to utilitarianism. So in short, as you think about self-interest and whether everything should be self-interested, make sure you clearly define the terms and stick to those clear definitions, which can be quite challenging. All right, let's go to the third criticism. So the gist of the third criticism is this. If you can think of some self-interested acts that you also think are wrong, then your morality is not based solely on self-interest. Or if you can think of some right acts that are not in your self-interest, that you think are not in your self-interest, then again, your morality is not based on self-interest, so you're not really an ethical egoist. So imagine you know it's in your self-interest to cheat on your ethics exam or kill someone for life insurance money. You absolutely know you could get away with it. And you think it's in your self-interest. In your moral opinion, are these kind of acts morally permissible since they're self-interested? That's the criticism. Even if you're not sure about this example, the crucial point is that you probably believe some acts are immoral even though they're self-interested, right? Taking the $1 million instead of doing the right thing, for example. So if so, your morality cannot be based solely on self-interest. Now, here's a response from the ethical egoist. A common egoist here would say, well, cheating and killing are not really in your self-interest because you might get caught or you experience the pains of a guilty conscience. So the egoist strategy is to list possible reasons for why killing, cheating, or stealing may not really be self-interested. In short, they argue none of these evil acts are self-interested and all truly good acts are self-interested. But now the non-egoist replies. The non-egoist thinks this reply is pretty weak. Historically speaking, hasn't genocide, rape, or following evil commands, hasn't that sometimes been in someone's self-interest? I think so. And personally speaking, has cheating ever been in your self-interest? Probably. Many people have good reasons for thinking it it was. So this leads to lengthy discussions, but the bottom line is there are examples in which right and self-interest are not aligned. People frequently experience their conscience saying no, while another part of their psyche says, yes, do it. It's in your self-interest. So the critic believes that the egoist reply is weak because good and self-interest are not always aligned. Okay, but there's a really interesting point that arises here. We could call it criticism 3.5. Isn't following your conscience a form of self-interest? So the egoist might say, look, I don't want to suffer from a guilty conscience, so it's in my self-interest to follow my conscience. So, or again, I don't want to live with a guilty conscience, so it's not in my self-interest to kill or cheat. But notice the egoist has not proven that their conscience is based solely on self-interest because they have only given a self-interested reason for following their conscience. That is, finding self-interested reasons to be moral does not make morality self-interested. So consider the following point. Your conscience probably says no whenever you're tempted to cause unnecessary suffering or treat a person as a mere thing. If so, your conscience or morality may be based on reducing unnecessary suffering or treating people with respect or wanting the good of the other as other altruistically. And it simply doesn't matter if doing so is in your self-interest. But your motive for following your conscience might be self-interested. So having a self-interested reason to follow your conscience does not prove your conscience is self-interested. And that's a really interesting, subtle point, right? We don't want to confuse the motive to follow conscience with a principle of conscience. So to summarize, the critic of egoism believes your conscience is deeper than self-interest because the good act and the self-interested act are not always aligned. And it's your conscience that judges when it's right or wrong to act on self-interest. Your conscience sometimes asks you to act against your self-interest, and so your conscience or morality cannot be based solely on self-interest. And even if you have a self-interested reason for following your morality, your conscience, it doesn't make your morality or conscience self-interested. All right, that one is always a challenge to verbalize. Okay, let's move to criticism 4. So the fourth criticism is a common textbook criticism, and it's brought up by the question, why should ethical egoists care about posterity? It reminds me of an old Greek proverb, a society grows when old men plant trees, in whose shade they shall never sit. So many of you feel a moral duty to posterity, to the future, let's say in 100 years. For example, you believe in reducing the national debt or saving the environment for the future. But ethical egoism seems to imply you have no such duty because you'll be dead in the future. That is, ethical egoism bases morality solely on self-interest, and so it follows there's no morality if your self no longer exists in 100 years. So to put it bluntly, an ethical egoist should not care about the future or posterity because she'll be dead in the future. And so ethical egoism just cannot explain any moral obligations that you have to posterity. Now, what's the response here? Well, ethical egoists often respond in the following way. They say, by self, I mean my grandchildren, great-grandchildren, my genes, or maybe my species. Self-interest is anything I value or identify with. So this reply explains why some ethical egoists believe there is a self-interested moral duty to posterity, since self now includes future people, not just myself at this time. So it's self-interested to reduce the national debt and clean up the environment because self includes genes and memes that will survive after my death. Okay, the non-egoist comes in and says, look, the problem with this reply is the egoist has inflated the meaning of self to meet the posterity objection. In other contexts, egoists use self-interest to refer to improving a person's body or psyche. Self-interest did not mean improving others for their own sake. It meant helping others only if doing so ultimately benefited oneself. In other words, the ethical egoist used self-interest to mean only I has intrinsic value. The new definition of self is everyone I identify with has intrinsic value. So if one allows this inflated definition of self, the theory now becomes closer to utilitarianism than ethical egoism. And another problem is that if one accepts this inflated definition of self, it could then be self-interested to jump on the grenade to save the 10 children. But this is absurd because you don't make your life better by ending it. So in short, this criticism is that ethical egoism implies you have no moral duties to posterity. And this is a problem because most people believe they do have such duties. The most common egoist reply then subtly inflates the meaning of self and self-interest so that the new meaning of self includes more than themselves. And so the critic believes the egoist has not presented a good argument for the claim that moral obligations to posterity can be based solely on self-interest. Now, the ethical egoist might claim, but it is in my self-interest to care about people in 100 years, even though I'm dead, because I'll feel guilty if I don't, and that's a self-interested reason. But the problem here goes back to a point we made earlier. You could have a self-interested reason for following your conscience, which makes you feel guilty, but that doesn't mean that your conscience, your morality, is based on self-interest. Okay, so the fifth criticism. Let's move on to James Rachel's The Elements of Moral Philosophy, where he asks, do your interests count for more than other people's interests just because they're your interest? Is ethical egoism arbitrary in an unacceptable way? So in this book, The Elements of Moral Philosophy, James Rachel's argued that this is the deepest criticism of ethical egoism. He believes that egoists think like racists and sexists because they all think that their interests count for more simply because they're in the right group. Racists and sexists believe there is us and them, and we're better because we are us and they are them. Egoists also divide people into two arbitrary groups, for they believe there is me and everyone else, and me is all that ultimately matters. Me is all that intrinsically matters for the egoist. So if you ask an egoist why their interests always count for more, they may say because they are my interest. But this answer is no better than the racist answer that my group is better because it is my group. So remember, in previous chapters we explored how your morality involves reducing suffering in all people, not simply yourself. Think of all the people you encounter today. Do their interests not count? Do you not care about them? Do others have feelings, goals, pains, pleasures, and interests just like you? Why should your pain count for more than their pain simply because it's your pain? Isn't the starving child sometimes on par with your own interests? Does a starving child only have instrumental value, as egoism maintains? Or do both you and the starving child have intrinsic, fundamental value, as non-egoism maintains? So at this point, it's too simplistic to say morality is always about self-interest. When you think morally, you're considering your interest, but you're also considering the interest of other people for their own sake. You're weighing the two. So your conscience seeks the good of the other as other. It doesn't simply seek the good for some self-benefit. In other words, self-interest can be a virtue, but it's not the only virtue, I think, according to your conscience. Now, at this point, some egoists claim that it's bad to always be altruistic, but this is a straw man fallacy. The non-egoist is not arguing you must always sacrifice your own interest. The non-egoist is arguing that all people have intrinsic value, not simply yourself. The non-egoist understands that you can have too much or too little self-love, while the egoist only understands that one can have too little self-love. The non-egoist believes that self-love is a virtue, but it's not the only virtue, but the egoist believes self-love is the only virtue, self-interest. The egoist is the one making an absolutist claim when he claims that all immorality should be about self-interest. So in short, the argument is that ethical egoist or ethical egoism does not even enter the moral sphere of thinking, because moral thinking begins when one starts considering other people's interests for their own sake, not simply for how they can benefit yourself. Now, sometimes we think, but isn't ethical egoism just putting yourself first? Right? We cannot really help others unless we help ourselves first. For example, you must put on your airplane oxygen mask before you can help others with their mask. Now, I agree that there's much wisdom in putting yourself first or taking care of yourself so you can better care for others. But this is not what ethical egoists say. They aren't simply saying put yourself first. The controversy is they're saying you're the only person who intrinsically matters. Others matter only in instrumental ways. And egoists really say that. For example, look at the Johnny Carson interview on YouTube with Ayn Rand. And at minute 4:15, Rand states, you shouldn't serve yourself first, you should serve only yourself. She goes on to explain that egoists who share similar moral values serve each other, but that man doesn't have to serve anyone except himself, end quote. So egoists believe others have instrumental value and only you, or in this case, only me, has intrinsic value. Ethical egoism implies it's always morally right to put your interests first because your interests are all that ultimately matters, intrinsically. So the word always, all, and only are the problem with Rand's egoism. So Rand's the one making absolutist claims, not the non-egoist. So the textbook criticism is that ethical egoists like Rand present two options, only self-interest or only altruism, when there's a third option. The non-egoistic third option is a better description of morality in stating that it's morally right to pursue your self-interest, but it's sometimes morally right to sacrifice self-interest for the interest of others. In other words, your conscience is aligned with this third option instead of egoism because your conscience tells you everyone is intrinsically valuable, not only yourself. You can see Aristotle's golden mean or Chesterton's ethics for more illustrations of this. But to summarize this criticism, egoism is not putting yourself first. It's the idea that you are the only one that ultimately matters. You are the only person with intrinsic value. But this does not accurately describe your morality, which is based on the idea that everyone is intrinsically valuable. And this does not mean you must always sacrifice yourself for others, as some ethical egoist maintains. It means that the moral life is a balance of self-interest and altruism. And, it's interesting at this point just to mention that ethical egoism may be a good medicine for some of you because you're too sacrificial. And so it's a good medicine at a certain stage in life to focus mostly on yourself. And when you're young, too, many traditions, like the Hindus, for example, say it's good to be mostly selfish, but you'll eventually grow out of it and experience something more. So as a student, you should be mostly focused on self-interest. And then later in life, perhaps, you can be less and less so, especially when you have children. So let me do a summary and conclusion, and then I'll talk a little more about Ayn Rand and Dostoevsky and some case studies. So the conclusion is that philosophers have debated the relationship between self-interest and morality for thousands of years, and some have argued that morality is based solely on self-interest. The main problem with this egoist idea arises when you realize that some of your deepest moral values are not based on self-interest, unless you inflate the meaning of self-interest. Right? So while ethical egoists rightly recognize their own intrinsic value, that self-interest is a virtue, they fail to recognize the intrinsic value of others. Another problem with ethical egoism is it may prevent you from experiencing the deeper and more meaningful truths in life if those truths, like friendship and deep love, involve something more than seeking a benefit for yourself. So in short, ethical egoists rightly recognize that self-love is a virtue, but they're mistaken in believing it's the only virtue. However, again, ethical egoism may be good medicine for people who are too agreeable or let others walk all over them. It may be useful in some stages of life. Still, most philosophers believe you could overdose on this medicine. All right, so let me point out something about Ayn Rand, because I'm not doing her justice by reading her text right now. So, defenders of Ayn Rand rightly state that she believed we should not use violence against others. And to her credit, this is a moral maxim in her philosophy. Don't hurt others, right? However, it's quite another thing to prove that this moral maxim is based solely on self-interest. And I don't think Ayn Rand has proven that. That is, she does not prove principles like nonviolence can be grounded solely in self-interest. And so what she's doing, I think, is smuggling non-self-interested values into her self-interested philosophy. The problem for Rand is the moral principle that one should not use unnecessary violence. It's true regardless of self-interest. It's immoral to harm others because morality implies all people are intrinsically valuable, not simply oneself. Your conscience tells you it's wrong to cause unnecessary harm, and it will continue to do so, even when you cannot find a self-interested reason for reducing harm in another person. Again, the problem is some of Rand's moral duties, like never using violence, are not grounded in self-interest, but instead from a conscience that seeks the good of the other as other. All right, so that's an overview on ethical egoism. I could blabber on for hours about this topic. It's fascinating. Especially as you discuss it, you'll notice people shifting the meaning of self and self-interest. And I go back to the caterpillar and butterfly as the caterpillar seeking self-interest, losing the self, preserving the self, transcending the self, or doing something else without the self or with the self. So there's a lot of confusion when it comes to terminology in this debate. I could also talk about Dostoevsky and crime and punishment and how all that relates. That's a great discussion. But and again, with ethical egoism and Ayn Rand, a lot of people find her and they live a better life because they read her. And so, but any structure approach when you're unstructured may be beneficial, right? So there's so much more to discuss. It's fascinating, but my position is ultimately that ethical egoism is just not a very strong theory. All right. Have a great day. Thanks.